Hello and welcome to this game review. We'll have a look at some King's Indian strategy, and then later we'll explore an endgame that perhaps looked better than it actually was. So we have some King's Indian, very normal, and black plays this knight b d7 move, so the point of this is kind of to avoid the exchange variation and the trade of queens. Of course, the exchange variation is objectively nothing special for white, but some players prefer to not allow it. And then e5, bishop e3, and black plays this move queen e7, which is kind of a waiting move, kind of a useful move here. And the point is to kind of wait for what white does and either take on d4 or try to develop with b6, bishop b7, or just c6, or sometimes even c5, though that's less likely because it gives up the d5 square. So white decides to play d5, and this may be a bit inaccurate because this allows black to develop the d7 knight to c5 easily. And the point is, while we have the pawn on d4, this knight on d7 can't really go anywhere unless black at some point takes on d4. So white could still make some useful moves like queen c2, rook e1, rook c1, or rook a d1, and black can't really do anything special. For example, he can take, but this structure is known to be better for white if he consolidates. So usually we should not allow the black knight to develop so easily. For example, after a5, the knight can go to c5, and black has a harmonious setup. So instead white takes here, but this is not considered very good for white because the d6 pawn is not really a big weakness, and if black gets to play bishop b7 and d5 comfortably, then he will equalize or even be better because of the mobile kingside majority. The standard plan for white here would be to play b4 and b5 to try to win this square on d5, not to mention to just push his queenside majority and maybe create a passed pawn on the queen side. So play should be quite easy. For example, b4, bishop b7, a4, and the white's play is aimed at playing on the queen side with b5 to either win the square on d5 or just to not allow d5 by black. So instead queen e4, white puts his queen on a3, but this is kind of a strange way to play. And here black can stop this b4 idea once and for all, and it's not clear what white should do here. For example, after rook fd1, not only can black play this move, knight c5, but also just c5, and this queen is strangely placed, and black has the initiative in the center. So knight g4 happens, we will skip a few moves. Black develops quite strangely. After knight c5, now white should again understand his main plan, which is b4 and b5, just push b4. Knight e6 will be played aiming to go here, but white can, not only can he ignore it, but he can just put his knight on b3. Next, he is also kind of threatening knight a5, but mainly b5 or even c5 to open up the bishop to c4. And black's pieces on the king side are quite weirdly placed, and white should be quite a bit better here. But knight b3 happens instead. So this is fine if here, if black wouldn't make c5, white would eventually play b4 again. After c5, now the aim is to pick up the d5 square and hopefully try to play against the d6 pawn eventually. Bishop g4 is played and h3. So white here gives up the bishop pair, but it wasn't really necessary. White has more space, so he should just play in the center. For example, queen c2. Probably the simplest is again to play a3 and b4 to try to put pressure on the queen side. But okay, here we get some exchanges and eventually white gets this kind of perfect position where all of his pieces are better, and he has play on the d file, the d5 square, and the d6 square. So after f5, black is looking for dynamics. E takes f, rook c to d8, and here white decides to exchange everything, though probably the best idea is to try to play on the queen side. For example, here. Now if black takes this pawn, we will take the one on a7, So probably white is just winning a pawn. Otherwise, the threat is b4 to get some access to the d6 square. After queen d3, now the big mistake by white was to exchange queens, because in this endgame, white doesn't really have any targets. His bishop on g3 is poorly placed, and now the king safety of black, which was bad, does not have any more significance. On the contrary, black's king has easy access to the center, while white's king is still quite far away. We should really avoid this queen exchange. Maybe this was directed against the rating of the opponent. Perhaps white was scared and thought he could never lose the endgame with such good squares. But unfortunately, this is how we lose against higher rated players. Usually it's in an endgame. So instead, something like queen e2 should be played, or queen d5. Either way, to avoid exchanging the queens, we should double on the d file, and white is better. But now white puts his rook on d5, but unfortunately this rook is useless on d5, and now only black can play for a win because he has this plan of a5 and a4, which worked perfectly for black. Well, white doesn't really have many targets. He should probably try to bring the king somewhere. f3, king f2, king e3, and king e4, but the king is not necessarily better here. Bishop e1 would at least stop a5 for now. But okay, here the last mistake by white was taking with the rook on b3, because now white has two weaknesses instead of one. Had he taken with the a pawn, now he has only one weakness, though you could say the a file is another weakness. But unfortunately, after this and a few moves later, white is losing his c4 pawn, after which he is losing the a pawn as well, and from here the position is basically hopeless. Now that the c4 pawn is gone, black will push his king, his center majority, and white still hasn't gotten any counterplay. So probably the big mistake was to exchange queens, and usually when we ask ourselves if we should exchange queens, there's two questions. What's the king safety situation? So long term black's king is of course less safe than white's. And how are the endgame prospects? Unfortunately, the endgame is nothing special for white. He doesn't really have real targets. The king can easily defend d6 as well as the bishop, and white's pieces are not really in a position to play an endgame.